last month, to help us get started, or to help us get ready for VBS, we took a break from this sermon series that we've been going through for the majority of this year. And if you just started coming to LeClaire last month, or maybe you're new today, essentially what we're doing is we're taking a lot of time. I don't know exactly how long this is going to take, but we're just slowly walking our way through the life and the ministry of Jesus. And instead of looking at one gospel, we didn't really want to just look at one of the gospels because we feared, I feared that if we just looked at one, there would be so much that we would miss that's told about the story of Jesus and the others. And so we're kind of taking this chronological look or even this harmony-like look at the life and ministry of Jesus. And so what we've covered so far, whenever we stopped at the end of June, we saw that Jesus' ministry, it's not necessarily new anymore. It's still pretty early on, but I wouldn't say that his ministry is new. His reputation has been growing. His following has been growing. But as his reputation and his following are growing, there's also this group of people who many of them have heard about the miracles of Jesus. Some of them have even experienced the miracles of Jesus. Many of them have heard the teachings of Jesus, and some of them have even experienced the teachings of Jesus. But while Jesus' reputation and his following grows, this group of people, they're just not very big fans. And of course, we're talking about these religious leaders who they feel threatened by Jesus. They feel threatened by his teachings. They feel threatened by his power. They feel threatened by the response that people have to Jesus. And so time and time again, we've already seen that they've tried to intimidate Jesus. They've tried to stop this Jesus movement before it even really fully gets going. And so today, in our journey through the life and the ministry of Jesus, we're going to move into a new part of Jesus' ministry. And this is probably one of the most quoted parts in all of Jesus' ministry. Today, we're going to begin our walk through Jesus' teaching called the Sermon on the Mount. And this one sermon series that we're in right now, we're going to be here pretty much up until Christmas time. So go ahead and become very familiar with this part of the New Testament. But Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. Ever since Jesus stepped onto the pages of history, Jesus has been the most intriguing, probably the most controversial, and even the most influential person to ever live. For the better part of 2,000 years, people have been trying to figure out exactly what to make of this Jewish carpenter who also happened to claim to be the Son of God. And so people have asked all these questions to try and figure out, who is Jesus? Like is Jesus, who was he? Is Jesus just some sort of a charismatic leader? Well, was he just some sort of magician who was able to do all kinds of miracles? Was he nothing more than a prophet or a religious figurehead? Or probably the most common question that people have asked whenever they're trying to figure out who is Jesus is Jesus really nothing more than a great moral teacher? But this idea that Jesus is nothing more than a great moral teacher, it's just flawed from the very beginning. Whenever it comes to Jesus, I think C.S. Lewis puts it the best. We've talked about this a couple of months ago, but C.S. Lewis says that there's really only three options for who Jesus could be. Jesus could be a liar. He could have been somebody who said that he was the Son of God, who could have said that he was God while knowing that he was not God. He could be a lunatic, meaning that he claimed to be God. He really thought that he was God, but he was not God. Or he can be Lord. He could be exactly who it is that he claimed to be. But here's the problem with this question. Is Jesus nothing more than a good moral teacher? It is impossible to be a good moral teacher while being a liar. It is also impossible to be a good moral teacher while being a lunatic. The only way that you could ever say that Jesus is a good moral teacher is if you also are willing to say that Jesus is Lord. However, one of the main reasons that there are people who don't really follow Jesus, who don't claim to be Jesus' followers, but believe that he is nothing more than a great moral teacher, one of the main reasons people have that belief is because of the Sermon on the Mount. This sermon that Jesus delivers here in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7 is literally gives us some of the greatest moral teachings that have ever been given. It's considered the masterpiece of Jesus' teaching. It's full of teachings that Jesus would just repeat again and again and again and again. I remember in my homiletics class, my preaching class in Bible college, one of the things that they always tell students in Bible college is you need to have that back pocket sermon. Like if you go on a missions trip or something like that, and all of a sudden somebody hears that you're a preacher, there's a really good chance that at some point in your life, somebody's going to be like, hey, you're a preacher, will you preach a sermon for me? And so they always talk about you need to have this back pocket sermon that you can just preach at any time, just something that just lives in your brain, that can always be available at the drop of the hat. I believe that the teaching that we see in the Sermon on the Mount is essentially Jesus' back pocket sermon. And in it contains the famous Beatitudes. We see the Lord's Prayer. We see the teaching to love our enemies and to pray for those who persecute us. We see teaching about judging others. And we even see the teaching of the golden rule, which we are taught as little children. It really doesn't even matter if you're a Christian or not. Every single person in this room is familiar with at least part of the Sermon on the Mount, whether you know why you're familiar with it or where that teaching even came from. And so as we go into Matthew's gospel here, just as a reminder, one of Matthew's main goals in his gospel is to prove that Jesus is the prophesied Messiah. And he begins this at the very beginning in Matthew chapter 1 by showing us that Jesus, he is a son of Abraham. He also tells us that Jesus is a son of David. He shows us this through the telling of Jesus' family line, through the telling of his genealogy. And after he gives us the genealogy, he immediately moves into the birth of Jesus. And he shows how in the story of the birth of Jesus, multiple Old Testament prophecies have been fulfilled. But after sharing the genealogy and after sharing the story of Jesus' birth, Matthew moves into this other goal. And it's like kind of throughout the rest of his gospel, one of the goals of many, but one of the goals that he's trying to accomplish is to make this connection between Jesus and Moses. And this will come up again and again and again throughout the rest of the gospel. We'll see that Jesus and Moses, they both came up out of Egypt. Jesus and Moses, they both passed through the waters. Jesus through the waters of baptism, Moses through the waters of the Red Sea. We see that Jesus and Moses, they both were sent into the wilderness. Moses for 40 years and Jesus for 40 days. We see that both of them will give teaching or give laws on the side or on top of a mountain. We see that both of them would deliver their people from slavery. And we see that both of them will give and establish a new covenant. But Matthew, he doesn't connect Jesus and Moses as equals. Instead, he shows that Jesus is a new and a better Moses. Where Moses would deliver his people from slavery in Egypt, Jesus would deliver his people from the slavery of sin. Where Israel would repeatedly violate the old covenant and become slaves again and again and again, Jesus' new covenant would be an everlasting, once and for all kind of covenant. And the covenant that God made with Moses, it was so beautiful. But Jesus and his covenant, it's just better. Where the old covenant was dependent upon man and their ability to not rebel, Jesus and his new covenant was dependent upon him and what he would do on our behalf. The author of Hebrews, he describes this perfectly whenever he says in Hebrews chapter 8, by calling this covenant, the Jesus covenant, new, he has made the first one obsolete. And what is obsolete and outdated, it will soon disappear. But it's this new covenant of Jesus that is at the very core, that's at the very heart of the Sermon on the Mount. And so today as we begin this series, I'm not going to begin in Matthew chapter 5, verse 1 at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. Instead, I'm going to go about halfway through Matthew chapter 5 because it's there that we can kind of just see the purpose for this sermon that Jesus gives. Here's what it says, Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 17. Do not think, Jesus says, that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but I have come to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter nor the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. So as we go through those 4 verses there, the very first thing that jumps off the page to me when I read this text is where Jesus says that he has not come to abolish the law, the old covenant, the law of Moses, but instead he has come to fulfill the law. And whenever I read these words, I'm immediately reminded of the story that happened shortly after the resurrection of Jesus. It's found in Luke chapter 24, and Jesus is resurrected, and he's walking along the road, and he ends up encountering a couple of his disciples. One of the disciples was named Cleopas. We don't know the name of the other disciple, but they encounter the resurrected Jesus, but for whatever reason, they were not able to recognize that's who it was. They didn't know that it was Jesus who came alongside them and ended up walking with them. And Jesus looks at them, resurrected. Again, they don't know that it's him, but Jesus, he looks at them and he can see that Cleopas and this other disciple, that they are so sad, that they're just overwhelmed with grief. And so Jesus goes up to them and asks them, hey, what's wrong? What's going on? Why are you so downtrodden? Why is your heart so troubled? And Cleopas and the other disciple, they look at Jesus like he's an idiot. Like, what do you mean what's wrong? How do you not know? Where have you been these last few days? How have you not heard of what has happened? And Cleopas and the other disciple, they go on and they start to tell Jesus all about Jesus. But again, they don't know that's who they're talking to. And eventually, after a while, they end up telling Jesus that Jesus, it's so strange, but they're telling Jesus that Jesus had been crucified and that he had been buried in a tomb, but now his body is gone and they don't know what to make of it. And so eventually they stop and Jesus, he says to them, he says, how foolish you are. And how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer those things and then enter his glory? Then verse 27. And then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Jesus explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning him. It was literally the greatest Bible study that's ever been given. Jesus just stops and he starts telling Cleopas and this other disciple all about, from Genesis, through the end of the Old Testament, how everything existed and how everything happened to ultimately point to him. There are 2 ways that we can read the Bible. You can read the Bible from cover to cover with no preconceived gospel notions or anything like that, just looking at it as individual story after individual story after individual story after individual story. To where maybe you can get some good life principles or some good life teaching out of them. Like that is one way that you can read the Bible. But the other way that you can read the Bible is, again, from cover to cover or however, but where Jesus is the center of the Bible. To where the entire story revolves around him, that the entire story revolves around God's redemptive plan that is found in Jesus Christ. And it's this second way that Jesus is telling Cleopas and the other disciple, and by extension, it's this second way that Jesus would tell us, that's how you're supposed to read the scriptures. And it's the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus is saying, this is how you're supposed to read the scriptures. All the prophets and all the law were given to point to Jesus. I love what the Apostle Paul says about this in Romans chapter 8, beginning in verse 3. He says, for what the law was powerless to do because it was weakened by the flesh, God did by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh to be a sin offering. And so he condemned sin in the flesh, in order that the righteous requirements of the law might be fully met in us who do not live according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. The law was designed to show us where we fall short and where the law is incapable of returning anyone to a right relationship with God. And the law, it can tell us how to live, but the law cannot empower us to live in that way. And so we see that no longer, because of Jesus, because of this new covenant, no longer is the law written on tablets of stone, but now the law is written on the flesh of the heart. But rather than destroy the law, Jesus has come to fulfill the demands of the law. And in doing so, he bears the punishment for us breaking God's law. A better way to put this is the law reveals our need for a Savior. And Jesus comes in and says, let me take care of that. The other part of Jesus' words here in Matthew chapter 5 that jump off the page to me are found in verse 20, where it says, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Throughout Jesus' ministry, we know, we've talked about this at length here in the past several months, but this is the group, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, this is the group that Jesus constantly bumped heads with. This is the group that Jesus, was so frustrated. He found himself at odds with because the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, they would continually add new laws onto the 613 laws that Moses had already given. And they were so afraid of breaking any of these laws, it's like they just would add all these guardrails to make sure that they were good. And as a result of this, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, they were really, really good. They were really, really good at being good. They were really, really good at following all the rules. And so you can imagine what was going through the minds of Jesus' audience whenever they heard Jesus say, your righteousness must surpass that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law if you want to enter the kingdom of heaven. They would have heard it like this, your rule following and your goodness and your religiousness, it must surpass that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law if you want to enter the kingdom of heaven. And they would have thought, if that's the case, Jesus, we have no shot. And they would have been right. But Jesus is about to completely flip the script on them all. You see, the Pharisees had taught and lived an external-only righteousness. They claimed that people were only righteous because of their actions, but their preaching completely ignored their heart. Even if their actions were good, their hearts were not. And Jesus was about to explain that true righteousness, that God's righteousness that is evident in God's kingdom would have to go beyond the external, and it would have to go into the internal and overflow into everything else. It is the internal righteousness that overflows into our external actions. And so Jesus, he would go on to explain this and how the Pharisees, how they may have had it right under the law of Moses, under the old covenant, but they were completely missing what really matters whenever it comes to the new covenant of Jesus. And here's what Jesus says. And we'll cover a lot more of this in the weeks to come. But beginning in Matthew chapter 5, verse 21, he says, you have heard that it was said. That is the old. He's pointing back to the old. This is what you've heard forever. You've heard that it was said. This is the law. This is the old covenant. This is what you heard it was said to people long ago. You shall not murder. Murder is an external action. It's one of the big 10 commandments that we're told not to break. And anyone who murders is subject to judgment. You've been taught that ever since you were little children. But I tell you, anyone who is angry with a brother or sister, that is internal, will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court, and anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you're offering your gift at the altar, and there you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there at the altar, in front of the altar, and first go be reconciled to them, and then come and offer your gift. Verse 27, you have heard that it was said, this is old, you shall not commit adultery. That's one of the big 10 again. But I tell you, anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. That's internal. It had been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Verse 33, you have heard that it was said to people long ago, this is the old, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows that you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond that comes from the evil one. Verse 38, you have heard that it was said, this is old, this is what you've been taught from the very beginning, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you to resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. Verse 43, you have heard that it was said, this is old, love your neighbor but hate your enemy. That's how we've been taught. That's what we've been told from the very beginning. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes the sun to rise on the evil and on the good. He sends sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even the pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your Father in heaven is perfect. Jesus is saying, you've been told this forever, but I'm getting ready to give you something that is brand new. The very first the very first heart transplant surgery that was ever done was performed by a doctor by the name of Dr. Christian Barnard. And the surgery was actually done on another doctor, a doctor by the name of Philip Bleiberg. And sometime after the surgery, Dr. Bleiberg came back to Dr. Barnard's office, and there sitting on a shelf was Dr. Bleiberg's old heart. He was literally the first person in human history to be able to take a look at his own heart. And eventually, Dr. Barnard said, "Hey, Philip, do you want to hold your heart in your hands?" And so he walked over to this jar that was sitting on the shelf, and he brought it back over to Dr. Bleiberg. And Dr. Bleiberg, he just stands there, as I think we all would, like he's in complete shock. He's just staring at this organ that's in this jar. And he stares at it for minutes. And eventually he doesn't say a word, and he just goes back and he puts the heart on the shelf, and then he goes and takes a seat in Dr. Barnard's chair. And it's silent. And then eventually Dr. Barnard goes up to him and he says, "Philip, I just have to ask, what's going through your mind? I mean, you're literally the first person to ever hold your own heart in your hands. What's going through your mind?" He said, "Honestly, the only thing that I can think is, there it is. There's that old heart that's caused me all that trouble for all these years." A new heart is at the heart of Jesus' new covenant. And with these words, you have heard it said, but now I tell you, Jesus and his new covenant, they are off and running. Jesus would say, "No longer am I solely concerned with your external actions, but now my primary concern is with your heart. It's with your motives. No longer can you put on an outward show to prove your spirituality. Now we are focused more on a transforming relationship with Jesus. Behavior modification is a thing of the past. We're looking for this new kind of transformation that will allow you to truly love your neighbor in a brand new kind of way. A love for your neighbor that will allow you to even love your enemies." And this is huge. Where the old covenant, where the law was based in fear, this new covenant, it is based in hope. And church, hope is always a better motivator than fear. It doesn't mean that things will be easier. In fact, I think all of us would probably agree. Whenever you look at Jesus' new covenant, even just those words that we read there in Matthew chapter 5 today, you have heard it said, but now I tell you. Jesus' new covenant is not easier. It's probably a lot more difficult. But it's still better. Because Jesus is calling his audience to something more than what they were used to. He's calling them to something greater than they considered to be normal. And church, I believe that he might be doing the exact same thing for us today. Because Jesus fulfilled the heavy requirements of the law and has called us to put on his righteousness and to live in his new covenant, he's called us to something better. He's called us to a new ethic. He's called us to a new beginning. He's called us to a new opportunity. He's given us a new heart and a new hope to be made right with God through the sacrifice and the fulfillment of his Son, Jesus. And it's this hope that has to go beyond these church walls. It's this hope that a lost and a dying world needs. It's this hope that religious people who are just trying to follow all the rules, it's this hope that they need to find. And it's this hope that I hope will penetrate each and every one of our hearts, and in turn, God willing, it's this hope that I believe can change the world around us. Will you pray with me this morning? Father in heaven, I thank you for today and just the hope that is made available through your Son, Jesus. Father, I pray that that you will help each and every one of us to live out this new covenant righteousness. Not to where we try to become something that we're not, but that we allow the long form, the long-standing obedience, the long track obedience, that we allow that to do the bit-by-bit transformation. Father, I pray that today that we will take that very next step, whatever that very next step might be. I pray that we will take that next step in being transformed into the people that you desire for us to be. So, Father, I pray for every single one of us in this room. I specifically pray for those who may be trying to live with some external kind of righteousness, and I pray that they will see, that you will open their eyes to know that that is a fruitless fight. But instead, may they come and find hope and the truth of your Son's resurrection. So, Jesus, we thank you for the hope that is available in you. We thank you that you came and made a way on our behalf. And Jesus, it's in your name we pray. Amen.